Lecture 2. Which tools of thinking are basic?
We're talking about the tools that we use when we think. In our last lecture, I tried to delimit what we were doing a bit and to point out that we're not going to be talking about neurology and we're not going to be talking about linguistics, and tried to focus just a tiny bit in the direction of what we are going to be talking about. I want to begin today with a list of items that are going to be on our agenda. I'll give you the list, and then I'll go back over it again with a little bit more flesh on the bones, and we'll be off and running. I want to talk about the following tools of thinking: memory, association, pattern discernment and recognition, and reason. And those four are, I think, essentially processing tools of thinking. And then I'm also going to look at experience and invention, which I was talking about last time largely under the label of hypothesis construction, but more of that because there are other ways of inventing. Experience, invention, experimentation, and intuition. These four, I think, falling more in the area of where we get the input for our thinking, where the first four, memory, association, pattern discernment, and reason, have more to do with how we process it and what we do with it. A few of these I spent a fair amount of time on last time, but I do have a thought or two that I want to add to what was said there. A few of them I want to expand upon considerably today. Let's begin again with memory or recall. This came vividly to mind for me as I was just yesterday driving to the location where these films are being made, and found myself trying to work my way through Northern Virginia, which for a Richmonder is like an alien world, and trying to remember, do I want to go on Route 29 or do I want to go on Route 28? And digging back into my memory of the last time I made that trip and making a decision in terms of what I recalled. Now, one thing right up front to underscore: memory is fallible. And my memory yesterday was atrociously fallible. I made the wrong choice. Or perhaps it wasn't the wrong choice because of a failure of memory. Perhaps it was a wrong choice because they had decided to tear up the street right in the middle of the little town I was going through, and we waited for hours for the bulldozers to do their thing. But memory is not totally reliable. That's going to be a perpetually recurring problem, whatever kind of processing or inputting we're talking about. How trustworthy is this particular process? How trustworthy is this particular input as we try to think our way along? The association of ideas is another important processing tool. There's not as much to say about association of ideas, perhaps, as there is about reason that we're going to get to in just a moment. But it is crucially important. There's something about the way we're wired, if you please, that will trigger one idea or concept or notion or image or memory with another, perhaps not even obviously related, piece of input. I mentioned the other day that I enjoy doing the crossword puzzle. Now, my wife and I make a ritual of doing the crossword puzzle, the same puzzle, at the same time. It's not exactly a contest, but it's almost a contest. I'll get stumped on a word, but I don't want her to tell me the answer. And so I'll say, give me a hint. And she'll toss out some associated idea, or so on, and remarkably, that connection may occur. The mind, the human mind, has the ability to see connections and make connections. It's said that the sense of smell is one of the most powerful triggering mechanisms for conjuring up associated and related memories from the past. When we get to Mill in a few days, we're going to see that Mill had a great deal to say about the association of ideas and the ways in which we associate them. Perhaps because they are similar in form, perhaps because they occurred close to one another in time. But however we do associate them we will. And this, of course, as you well know, has interesting implications over in the area of psychological testing, as the psychologists love to play games with word association as a way of perhaps getting an insight into the particular way that we think, how we associate notions, perhaps in distinction to the ways in which others associate them. The ability to discern patterns and to recognize them when we see them again is not something that I'm going to dwell on today because I talked about it a fair amount last time, but I do want to give you one very, very real, everyday kind of example. When I was a very young man, I was very much in love with a very young woman who went to school in a different town from the town where I went to school. And so we hadn't seen one another for an extended period of time. It was approaching Thanksgiving, indeed, and we hadn't seen each other since before Labor Day. But I knew she was coming back to town, and I knew I was going to see her. And we were planning on seeing one another on a particular day. And as that weekend approached, I had reason to go downtown in Baltimore, which I did. And I got off the trolley car. Yes, it was that long ago. I got off the trolley car, and as I was standing on the corner, I looked up, and there she was. The light of my life, the true love of my heart. She was facing the other way, but I would have known her anywhere. So I yelled her name, and I ran, and I started to throw my arms around her, and she turned around, and it wasn't her. Severe trouble. Apologies. Severe apologies. Why do I bring this up? Pattern recognition is not always reliable either. We will think that we see a pattern that isn't there. Or we'll recognize a pattern when the pattern that we're recognizing, in fact, is different from the pattern that we see. Nevertheless, the ability to discern and to recognize patterns is crucial and central. Now, reason. One of the big guns. Reason comes in many forms. I'm thinking of reasoning. I'm not thinking of reasons. What was your reason for doing this or that? But how did you reason your way to that conclusion? Reasoning. We're going to look particularly at deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning at various points during this course. Deductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning where you work from a set of assumptions and allegedly reach a complete and guaranteed closure, a conclusion that is inevitable, that follows from those assumptions ineluctably. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is the kind of reasoning that we do when we work our way from some set of observations or some set of assumptions, and we work our way to a conclusion with some level of probability. Some level of probability. Quick examples. If I presume that all humans are mortal and I presume that Socrates is human, then I may deductively infer that Socrates is mortal. There's no way to get around it. On the other hand, if I have observed that this particular swan is white and that particular swan is white, and the 50 swans in the Thames River at Oxford are white, and all the swans in the Baltimore Zoo are white, and I then infer, well, probably swans are white. Well, probably. But then there's the black ones. Inductive reasoning doesn't give you the closure that deductive reasoning does, but both deductive and inductive reasoning are crucially important in getting from something that we believe or understand to some further step down the line, some new insight, some new understanding, some new way of construing and taking the facts so that we say we've made progress. We have moved in our thinking from here to there. There are other forms that reasoning takes also. We can reason by analogies. There are countless ways, but the ones that we're going to focus our attention on are going to be the deductive and inductive varieties. We're going to talk about deductive reason particularly when we talk about Aristotle, and then we're going to talk about deductive reasoning again when we get down to the 19th and 20th centuries. We're going to be talking about inductive reasoning particularly when we talk about Mill. Experience, as I've already indicated, is a crucial source of input. Now, sense experience, what you see, taste, smell, feel, and hear, and whatever other senses you may happen to have, but those are the standard ones. Sense experience is only one kind of experience. As I mentioned last time, there are those who claim to have religious experiences. There are those who claim to have revelations. There are those who claim to have extrasensory input, extrasensory perception. I'm not going to draw any line in advance in terms of what kind of experience we're going to tolerate and what kind of experience we're not going to tolerate. The only point I want to make right now is that the experiences that we have do provide most of the input that we reason about or that we reason with. It's crucially important, and it's cumulative. One of the wonderful things about experience. Now, this is not rocket science. I'm not telling you something that you don't know. I'm not telling you something that isn't indeed a cliche. We learn from experience. Well, of course we do. And wouldn't it be a terrible thing if we didn't? My father, who was a professional educator, used to have a cartoon on the wall over his desk. And it was a drawing of a small child standing by an ironing board, an old-fashioned ironing board. And there was an iron on the board, propped upright, plugged in, with squiggly lines rising off the iron to indicate that it was hot. And the child had a great enormous bandage on his little finger, and on his ring finger, and on his middle finger, and on his index finger, and he's reaching out toward that hot iron with his thumb, the sole surviving digit on the hand, and the label of that cartoon was Slow Learner. Well, indeed. If we didn't learn by experience, and if we don't learn promptly by the experiences that we have, we can suffer very grievous consequences, more than burned fingers. We can get killed if we didn't learn from experience. So experience is crucially important, and as I say, I don't want to prejudge or make any arbitrary restrictions on what kind of experience we'll do. We're going to come back to that, because we're going to discover that because experience is as undependable as it is, although in passing it's not nearly as undependable as a lot of people have accused it of being. We'll see. But because experience is as undependable as it is, we need to be cautious in the use of it. We need to set up some standards. We need to have some criteria, some benchmarks about what kind of experience is going to count and how much is it going to count. But we'll save that until we are spending a whole day on the process of experience as such. Invention, creativity, Last time I talked a bit about hypothesis construction. Where would we be if there were not those remarkable individuals who have the ability to invent a new way of seeing things, a new way of putting things together, a tentative but powerful new pattern of explanation, a new hypothesis? Now, in my experience, and I don't think my experience is uncommon here, in my experience, the number of people who have that ability to invent, to create, to make the bold imaginative leap, those people are relatively rare. Relatively rare. I think most of us, and I include myself firmly in the most here, most of us spend most of our lives exploiting and working with the imaginative and creative insights that the occasional creative thinking person provides. Indeed, if the world was full of Einsteins, then it would be terribly uncomfortable for the rest of us. Maybe it's good that the creative geniuses are relatively rare. The only other observation I'll make about the creative genius is not only that they're rare, but that there are a lot more who claim creative genius, I believe, than actually have it. But I'll let you make your own judgment about that. The important point is that unless someone from time to time boldly goes where no one has thought to go before, then we're not going to move into new territories of thought. I've recently been reading that wonderful little book from the 1940s by Paul de Kruif called Microbe Hunters. It's a book that was written for 12-year-old boys, I think. It's a book that embodies what my wife calls the gee whiz outlook on life. And I am incurably locked in the gee whiz outlook on life myself. So I've been enjoying the book all over again. But here were people relatively recently, late 19th century, who were inventing a new way to understand and explain disease. And if they hadn't, at great risk to their own lives on many occasions, we would not have made the strides in medicine that we have made in the last century. I suppose we'd still be going to the doctor to be treated with leeches and the like, rather than asking what new wonder drug is on the market. Along with invention, though, and I think they ride side by side, hypothesis construction being one kind of invention, remember, experimentation and testing. Doesn't do us much good to come up with a wonderful, bold, imaginary, that's a slip, but it's a good slip. I meant to say imaginative. But the risk is that what we intend to be imaginative may turn out to be imaginary. And so experimentation and testing has to ride with the invention so as to weed out and locate those inventions, those hypotheses that are going to bear fruit, that are going to be constructive, that are going to genuinely get us somewhere. One last comment on intuition. I wish I understood how intuition works, but I do know that it does work. I think of what I call, and others have called, this is nothing new, what I call aha moments. When I have looked and looked and looked at a pattern or a document or a puzzle or a problem, and all of a sudden I have, maybe it's like having a Gestalt shift. All of a sudden, I see it. It's there. I say, aha. That does happen. And I don't think that we can dismiss its happening. I don't think that we can dismiss the importance of its happening. But on the other hand, I don't think that we can sit around idly and wait for it to happen relative to most of the problems that we're trying to solve, most of the thinking processes we're trying to carry through. Great when it occurs, but in the meantime, there's work to be done, and the work is going to be done in the laboratory, in the field, in experience, in the reasoning process, and not simply in waiting on an aha. Well, these 8, and especially reason and experience and invention and experimentation, those 4, these, I think, are our fundamental thinking tools. They're the basic ones, and they're the ones I really want to look at closely over the 22 lectures that remain. These are the tools, indeed, that we have used to create our languages, verbal and mathematical. These are the tools that we have used to create our physical tools, the telescopes and the Geiger counters and the computers and all the rest. These are central. These are fundamental. Just in passing, there is a kind of chicken and egg question, I believe, about thinking on the one hand, reasoning, whatever processing it is, a chicken and egg question between thinking on the one hand and language use on the other. It's very difficult to figure out how you could think unless you had some linguistic tools in place to use. It's very difficult to figure out how you could come up with some linguistic tools to use unless you did a little bit of thinking to generate them. My guess is, and it's purely a guess, is that our linguistic capacities and our thinking capacities, broadly speaking, developed hand in hand, side by side, across vast eons of time. They certainly work together now. And as I said at the very beginning of the first lecture, if we don't have those linguistic, both verbal and mathematical tools in place, our thinking is not going to get very, very far. But it's clear, however, that the instruments and devices that we use, the Geiger counters and telescopes, and the languages that we use, are contingent on us. We have to be in place and functioning in order for there to be Geiger counters to use and language to speak. In some sense, we did invent the devices, and in some sense, we did put together the linguistic tools. They are derivative from something that is more fundamental. And I think that that's something which is more fundamental gets right back to what we experience, what we infer by way of reason, what we invent, and what we test and verify experimentally. Now, among those, if we look at thinking historically, we're going to see that different thinkers have emphasized different tools at different levels of importance. It's an interesting fact of history that many philosophers seem to zoom in on one particular tool of thinking and say, this is the important one, you can forget about all of those others. That is, I think, inevitably a mistake, but I'm going to have to make that point over the course of the course and not just say it up front. But I will say it up front. I think that the magic is in the mix. The magic is with reason and experience and invention and experimentation working together, rather than saying, oh, it's all pure reason or it's just experience. Anyway, different thinkers at different times have emphasized different ones quite dramatically differently. In ancient times, for example, as we'll see next time, Plato heavily emphasized intuition and memory and reasoning, especially dialectical reasoning, which I'll explain. He emphasized those very, very heavily and discounted sense experience almost entirely. It was of little interest or concern to him. And he had reasons, as we'll see. And along with sense experience, which he discounted heavily, he wasn't much interested in experimentation either. It was all much more of a mental enterprise, relying on what we can intuit and what we can remember and what we can infer. In contrast to that, another ancient thinker, Aristotle, who was, of course, Plato's student and was enormously influenced by Plato. But Aristotle gave a lot more attention to data collection. He was much more interested in the input that we get from field studies and from collecting things. He was sort of the first taxonomist, the first great classifier of biological specimens. When we get to Aristotle, I'll tell you a little story about how Aristotle built up his collection of biological specimens. But this was of central importance to him. Nevertheless, even though he did emphasize that, he went on and said, now, we've got to reason with this input. We've got to do something with it. And we owe to him the first, in the West at any rate, significant mapping out of the processes of reasoning in logic, and how we can reliably move from data in hand to some conclusion that is not yet, or at least not yet obviously, in hand. So Aristotle, in contrast to Plato, brought in experience, but also in contrast to Plato, rather than talking so much about intuition, he wanted to talk about what we can reason out through the hard work of logical inference. When we move to modern times, René Descartes, whom we shall talk about, again mistrusted experience almost entirely and insisted, no, we're going to have to rely upon what we can know by reason and reason alone. Now, that's a tall order, as we shall see, to try to figure out what can we know by reason and reason alone. Well, when we get to Descartes, we're going to see why he mistrusted experience as much as he did. We're going to see that he probably should have mistrusted reason a little bit more than he did. But the contrast is stark, say, between a Descartes on the one hand and a David Hume on the other hand, who says experience is key. It all comes down to what we can observe and then what we can derive based on those observations. Difficult processes. Then we'll also look a bit at Mill, who was one of the first to outline in any workable form a process in terms of which we can inductively reason, do what Hume was urging us to do, to take our observations and out of those observations reach more and more general truths and begin to put together some notion of natural laws. No accident that all of that is going on at the very same time that Western science, with a capital S, is really, really coming into flower, with a combination of observation, hypothesis construction, and testing, reason and experience working together to give us a level of understanding that had never been anticipated.